Hi. So I am very excited to be giving this talk. I have been working on this or variations of it for like almost 4 years now, and it's something I'm extremely passionate about. And I think it's also just kind of cool because, well, yesterday there was a talk called Navigation: The Future with Navigation 3. And then actually what this presentation about is it's actually a bunch of things. The first one is you're actually going to see a little bit of the slides that I pitched when I was at Google to the navigation team for Navigation 3 to become a thing. And then when we go through that, we're also going to see what we can actually do with Navigation 3 today in the context of compose and multi-platform apps. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to start with is I'm going to define some building blocks. I'm going to assemble those building blocks, and then there's going to be a nice little demo. So the first thing I'm going to start with is this, right? Here I have a phone. It's a basic phone screen, but I want you to also take notice of all the chrome around the UI. There's a toolbar, there's a floating action button, there's a bottom navigation bar. Now that you've noticed all of that, the next thing I want to draw your attention to is this little square here. I'm going to tap that square. And then when I tap it, I bet you know what will happen, right? You tap it, there's a shared element transition from one screen to the next. That makes sense. However, you may have noticed that the bottom navigation bar actually slid out. Interesting. If you're wondering where that square moved to, it's over here. And I'm going to tap it again. So I tap it again, the floating action button animates out, and then I move to this screen. I haven't done anything interesting or special so far. Almost everyone's app does this to some degree. However, I don't know about you, but I have been bitten by foldable phones for a while. I have been rocking the OG Pixel Fold for a bit. But for all of those transitions, I actually had to click a button. I actually had to press something for something to happen. But when you have a foldable phone, you can just open the device and you have a complete, you have navigation changes actually happen, but you actually didn't navigate anywhere. Again, I'm going to call your attention to the back here. Imagine there's a back button here or the up arrow. I'm going to tap it, and then when I tap it, then I go back to the previous screen. But because I have space, I'm actually showing the first screen to the left of it. And then again, I'm going to tap this button again. I go back forward, but Android 16 just announced that there is support for you can plug your phone to a monitor. So I could actually go home and plug my phone into a big screen. And then when I plug it in without any navigation changes, I get this. That's a lot happening, right? How do you, if you're building an app and most of the time you're focused on this one single thing in front of you, how do you scale that from just not just one to maybe two or potentially even three? Well, the first thing I like to do is I like to define those little color things. At the Google I/O talk last year, a term that was used that I think I'm very fond of, they were called panes. And maybe it's because I've been doing this for a while, but I do find pain to be very appropriate to describe it because trying to build for this can feel like, very painful. Hi, Harold, how are you? But you can think of a pane as the smallest atomic unit of your UI that represents a distinct navigation destination, that is, a nav entry. And an adaptive app is a backstack of one to big N panes where one to N panes may be shown simultaneously, where N is your function of your backstack and lowercase n is a function of your display. In other words, building an adaptive app is mapping your navigation state to the panes that are capable of being displayed. Okay, let's see what I mean by navigation state. Imagine you're building an app, you're in your home screen, right? And on the home screen, you push a button, you go to the post screen. You push another button, you're on the profile screen. And all of a sudden, you kind of have this kind of like back stack. But if you're building a modern app, most modern apps, it's not just a single step because they either have a bottom navigation bar or a navigation rail. So you actually have this other part of your app that you haven't modeled your navigation state for just yet. Now, when you have this navigation state, again, collectively, all of this is my navigation state. What I really want to do is I want to peek into that state and start putting it into one of these panes. In other words, I'm building an adaptive app. Again, for brevity, I will call this panes primary, secondary, tertiary. Now, well, again, I have my navigation state, and I kind of want to just put it in one of these. Now, if I'm on a phone, I have a compact display. What I want to do is, I think it's fairly simple. I really just want to take the home screen because I'm on the home screen, the home tab is selected, and I want to put it in the primary pane. Now, if I go to post and I navigate forward to post, I'm navigating forward within that stack. I'm still putting the post in the primary pane. Things get a little interesting when I have a medium display. In other words, a medium display is I can show two panes at the same time. So again, my post goes into the primary pane, which you'd expect. However, what goes into the secondary? Now, your first bet or your first guess might be like, I'm just going to look in my backstack and put the home in the secondary pane. But that isn't exactly what you may want to do because you're making an assumption that the navigation destination you want to show alongside your current one already exists. A better or more safe thing to do, actually, is when you're pushing the post screen, whatever screens you want to push alongside it, you push it with it into the backstack. Now, Navigation 3 actually lets you have duplicate things in your backstack. That's fine. You actually want to push it together. So in other words, what then happens is the post goes into the primary and whatever screen should show alongside it is secondary. No, but this is interesting because like I have a very weird data structure. How do I actually model this data structure? How does this actually fit into my backstack? And this is where I come to the next big thing. Your backstack and your navigation state can be two completely different data structures. Arguably, you would actually want them to be different data structures. So let's take a look at this navigation state and this backstack thing and try to make sense out of it all. So my navigation state is a data structure that sufficiently describes the navigation operations I want to perform in my app. It can be flattened to a backstack, and it most often is a graph. In other words, with Navigation 3, for the past 10 years or so, we've been talking about navigation graphs. Navigation 3 talks about backstack. It's not a dichotomy. They're not disagreeing with each other. In other words, you can represent your navigation state as a graph and then flatten it to a backstack. Now, personally, I am fond of multi-trees, right? Because all trees are graphs, even though not all graphs are trees. So when I'm trying to model this, I like to model my navigation state as a multi-tree. So what do I mean by this? So I'm talking about tree-based navigation state. Again, in Navigation 3, your backstack data structure can be anything you want it to be. I just happen to be using a tree. What you use will depend on what your product manager or what your app needs you to do. So the first thing I'm going to do in my tree is define the node. So again, the node is a node in my navigation graph. A node may be a pane. It does not have to be a pane, but it may be a pane. And if it's a pane, it is a nav entry for Navigation 3. So this is my basic declaration of what my node is like. It has some ID and it has a list of children, right? It's a multi-tree. Then within my tree, I have something I call a stack. A stack is also a node. It's a node with dedicated methods for push, pop, or any navigation I want to do in my app. So if you look at the declaration for a stack nav, it's got a name, it's got a list of children because it is also a node, and it has an ID. But then the interesting thing here you see is that I have a stack nav, I have a method called push, and then what I do when I push is, if I'm trying to push the same destination on, I just do nothing because I don't want to just stack the same navigation on top of itself. However, if it's a different one, I'm just going to add it to the tree. I'm just going to push something on the tree. Think of this as like, if you did stuff with XML and views, you've got a linear layout and you can traverse the children, the trees in the node. Then finally, I have something I call a multi-stack. And it's a collection of stacks with semantics for what back means. Now, in my case, my multi-stack nav has a name, but interestingly, it has something called index history, which is like on my bottom navigation tab, which tab have I last pressed? What is my history between those tabs? Then it has a current index, the tab that I'm actually currently on, and then it has a list of stacks because I have a different backstack for my bottom navigation bar. Then you can see that it also has an ID, but its children is the list of stacks it has. And then it also has a definition for pop. There isn't enough space to define what the pop method looks like, but here's the KDoc. What I'm trying to do is, if I'm on a stack and I've popped to the bottom of that stack, if I press back again, I want to shift to the last tab I previously visited if I had previously visited a tab. Otherwise, I probably want to quit my app. So if I go back to this navigation state that I talked about before, which I've represented with this tree data structure, you can see each of these. These are nodes within that graph. You can see I have a single stack nav for home, post, and profile. And the entire structure is my multi-stack nav. This is how I'm going to model my navigation for the rest of this presentation, and the app I'll show you. All right, so that's my navigation state. Then I want to actually convert this to a backstack because that is what Navigation 3 understands. It understands what a backstack is because it needs to be able to pop it. So you can imagine if I'm on the home screen, my backstack is just home. If I push both the post and the child, because I want to show them side by side, my backstack is now home, child, and post. And then if I go to the messages tab, in other words, I just tap the messages tab, my backstack is now home, child, post, and messages. If I go back and tap the home tab, you can see that I didn't add anything to my backstack. I just shuffled it. It just rearranged itself. And then if I pop, post and child off the backstack, I go back to this. And then if I pop it again, because I'm on the home stack, but I had previously gone to the messages, my backstack becomes this. And then if I pop it again, I quit the app. But the thing I want to drive in home here is that with single navigation actions, you may add to your backstack, you may remove to your backstack, you may add 1 or 2 or 3 things, or you may just shuffle it, right? But navigation is actually changing your navigation state. It's not just push and pop. Shuffles are valid as well. Okay. So now that we've defined what my navigation state is, let's go a little bit deeper. So in my app, I have my nodes are something I call a route, right? And a route has route parameters. Now, if you actually take a look at what my route parameters is, because my app and is multi-platform, I use URL strings to define my routes. So my routes are actually just strings. And so the ID is just the path fragment, everything before the query delimiter. And then when you actually parse the route, I have the queries in my route, I have the path arguments on my route, and I have a bunch of query parameters. So in my app, I'm talking about, the entire point of this app was how do I build a full, real world social media app with this? So here in my app, I have a post route. The route pattern is I have some profile, there's some handle, there's some post, and there's some ID for that post. So we're gonna try to build this with the definition I have so far. So to create my route, I'm going to create the route from some route parameters. Again, the route parameters are just it's just a URL segment that has been parsed. But then when I create the route, remember this is a tree, it's a node in a tree. So it may have children. If you look at the definition of route.panes, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into my route, look at the query parameters for my route, and look for any other string routes that I say I actually want to show alongside this route. In other words, the children are just in the query parameters. I've encoded everything in a single string. So, and then when you work with Navigation 3, you have to give it a nav entry. So for this particular route, I have 2 things. I have the composable that I actually want to render in this route, but also Navigation 3 gives you metadata. It lets you add whatever other information you want to put in this route. For me, what I want to put in this is I actually want to put a mapping of panes into it. In other words, when I'm displaying this route, I want to show this route in the primary pane. And if it has any child, I want to find that child and I want to render it in the secondary pane. Okay. For the render, we'll come back to that briefly, but let's move on. So when I want to show this route node in a pane, the thing that, again, I highlighted at the beginning that we have this persistent UI. You have a flow in action button. You have a navigation bar. You have navigation rails. You have flow in action buttons. But the thing I want to highlight is each of these panes individually should have their own instance. you probably shouldn't have to put your navigation bar in the root of your activity or in a fragment. You shouldn't have like a singleton. Give each pane its own. I am presenting this, I am claiming this without evidence. There is some evidence. It's a blog post. I do not have time to go into it. I will link to the blog post later. But let's just take my word for it. Let's see what we can do with it. And then you can ask me questions after. Sound good? Fantastic. Okay. So for my UI logic in panes, so there are actually going to be two things we need. If you've read the Android documentation, you may have seen that you have business logic, and there's a business logic stakeholder, which is a view model, and there's UI logic and a UI logic stakeholder. The UI logic stakeholder is just a plain class. So for this, I'm going to have a plain class, which is just an app state. And this is going to be the UI logic stakeholder for my application level state. Navigation state is application level state, so it will be my app state. Next, I'm going to have something called a scaffold state, and it's a UI logic stakeholder for delegating pane level animations and transition logic. Let's take a look at app state. My app state will pretty much is a simple class. In it, I have my navigation state. Notice how it is compose state backed, and it's a mutable state of that multi-stack nav, that tree that I defined earlier, right? This is in my app state. Then I have a list of navigation items. In other words, these are the items in my navigation bar in my navigation rail. Notice that I'm deriving that from my navigation state. And then interestingly, I have something here called a movable navigation bar. What I'm doing here is I'm using a compose API, a movable state of, not just only to hoist the state of a UI element, but I'm actually hoisting the entirety of the UI element itself. We're going to why in a second. But if you actually look at it, what I'm actually calling is this method called pane navigation bar. It takes in a modifier, it takes in a navigation item when it's reselected, a lambda. Let's take a look at a pane navigation bar. So notice here I'm writing my pane navigation bar as an extension function on my app state. So here I pass it the modifier and a lambda for when it's reselected. And when you look at it, this is just a basic navigation material 3 navigation bar, where all the navigation items that show up in the nav rail or nav bar actually come from my nav items. We haven't done anything fancy yet. The next thing is I'm actually going to store this in a composition local later. And again, I promise I'll come back to this. But notice that this composition local is internal. I have all of this in a module called a scaffold module. Individual feature modules cannot see this. This is local. Okay, we've defined the app state. Let's talk about the scaffold state. The scaffold state takes a lot of arguments, and I promise all of this is going to pay off. It takes in an animated visibility scope. It takes in a shared element transition scope, and then it has some logic for whether it's medium width or wider. And it also takes in my app state. In other words, my scaffold state depends on my app state. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make my scaffold state actually implement the shared element transition scope and animated visibility scope by just delegating to the parameters I pass to it. With that done, I can define my is medium width or wider value, read that. And then I have this value for, can I show my navigation bar? If my screen is medium or wider, I cannot show my navigation bar. And then there's also this other one where like, can I use a movable navigation bar? So there's a flag for the navigation bar and the movable navigation bar. Okay, now to create this in composition, what I'll do is I have this remember scaffold state method, and then I pass in my animated visibility scope, my shared element transition scope. Then this is where I use the navigation local before that I defined in the app level to read my app state. And then I pull in the value from medium width or wider. And then I create my scaffold state. The definition of medium width or wider depends on window size classes. Create your window adaptive info, create all of this, and then return an updated state for when your navigation, the window size class changes. You with me so far? There's going to be a lot more. Again, I promise it pays off. So next thing I want to do is, again, before I had the navigation bar as an extension function of my app state, now again, I'm defining my navigation bar as an extension function on my scaffold state. Again, I pass in a modifier, I pass in enter and exit transitions again. This time, the app state one did not have this. And then I pass in a lambda for when my navigation item is reselected. And then this is where things start getting interesting. In it here, I'm now passing using the animated visibility composable. And then I'm using the shared element modifier. After the shared element modifier, I'm not using that flag I defined before. Can I show my navigation bar? I pass it to visible. And then I pass in my enter and exit transitions. And then when I can use the movable navigation bar, I'm actually going to use the navigation bar that I hoisted into the app state. And then when I can't use it, I'm just going to use a simple one. Okay. That's just for defining like the logic within a pane. Next thing I want to do is actually I want to define a scaffold that actually shows all of these things. So my scaffold takes a modifier. It has a slot for a top-up bar, a flow in action button, a navigation bar or a navigation rail. It takes both. And then my composable content. Within it, I have a navigation rail scaffold. All this is a row with a navigation rail and my content. And then outside of that, I then put inside of that rather, I put in my scaffold and then I pass all these arguments into it. The reason I'm doing this is because all of these are extensions on the pane navigation state. And all these methods take the top app bar, the flow in action button, they take all of this as a receiver parameter for the function. Okay, why have I done this? Why is any of this complication necessary? The first APIs I used were the shared element transition APIs. And what this lets me do is I am on a single screen, and then as I go from one screen to the next, the shared element API lets me animate the flow in action button, and it makes the flow in action button look like it's the same flow in action button, even though it's completely two different flow in action button instances between the screens. But from the UI perspective, you couldn't tell. It looks like it's the single one. And then you may have remembered that I use a movable navigation bar. The reason I did that is if you look at the bottom at the navigation bar, as it's animating between screens, there's a little bit of an animation on the fluid action on the navigation bar that is not lost. If I didn't use a movable navigation bar, because it's going to be two different navigation bar instances, you would lose that little flare, that little persistent local animation. So that's why I had to hoist the entirety of my navigation bar. In other words, the shared element APIs give me consistency between panes. The next API I used was animated content. Animated content lets me do this. When I navigate from one screen to the next, I can actually locally for each screen define that as I'm going from one pane to the next, the bottom navigation bar is going to animate down. But I can choose a different animation on any screen. In other words, each screen is independent. If another screen wants the bottom navigation bar to rotate in, it can do it. So this is why I told you before, do not define a singleton. Different product managers will want to do different things on different screens. You need to keep this local. Let the screen be in control of its navigation or its animations. Do not define it as a singleton. Do not define it on the application level. The other API I used was animated visibility. And this is where things start getting really interesting. Because again, remember, we're still building from small to really big screens. As of right now, I have this screen. But as I expand, then this is running again on desktop. Because again, I'm saying this is multi-platform. As I go small and I go big, when I go out, the navigation bar animates out and the navigation rail animates in. So each Compose API lets you do something specific for your screen, and it keeps it local. Okay, now that we've talked about what APIs we use, in other words, it gives me consistency within a pane. This is what I broke down each animation API for. And then this is like, a mosaic of everything, just kind of neatly animating. This is all the architecture we've done so far has given us the ability to do all of this. Okay. Remember I said I was going to come back to this screen to talk about the render? Now that you understand what I use the app state for, and you understand why I've used the scaffold state, let's actually go ahead and build the UI for this screen. Okay, so when you look at my pane entry for this, the first thing it takes is a view model initializer. Please use view models, please. Um, so the very first thing I'm going to do is I create my view model. I use the view model factory method to get my view model. The state is just collect a state with lifecycle as you would expect. But here I have this interesting thing where I create a nested scroll connection. And then when I create that nested scroll connection, I'm actually going to pass it. So remember, we said we had the remember scaffold state. We pass in all the arguments for it. And then here I'm going to actually pass that nested scroll modifier, nested scroll connection to that modifier. I'll show you why in a second. But everything else is just basic. My top up bar is just a simple top up bar with a back button. My flowing action button is my own flowing action button. Again, the flowing action button is local to this screen. But then notice that it takes an offset, and then the offset is just going to be the offset given to me from my nested scroll. You'll see why this is important in a minute. The navigation bar does also something similar. It takes an offset for the modifier, and then I pass in that nested scroll. The pane navigation rail doesn't need anything special, so I'm just going to keep it as it is. And then my profile screen looks like this. I give it my state, I give it the actions it can perform on the view model, it takes a modifier, but I'm also passing the pane scaffold state to it. I'll come back to that in a second. But what this lets me do is, as I scroll, notice that the flowing action button and the bottom navigation bar animate out. But the minute I go to the next screen, I use the shared element transition APIs, and everything looks persistent. It looks like it's the same instance across different screens, but they're completely different instances. So when I scroll halfway, once I go to another screen, it doesn't matter if I had scrolled the bottom navigation out completely. It doesn't matter if it's halfway. Everything just flows. It's persistent. Different instances, but they act and look like singleton with the right architecture. Okay, so we've checked, there's a check mark for our render. Remember that I had a pane mapping before and I hadn't done anything with it yet? Well, let's get busy. Let's actually do stuff with it. So let's tackle multiple panes. Now, the interesting thing about the shared element transitions APIs is they're very binary. You can either see something is either visible or it's not. And this works well if you're working with just one screen. But if you're working on two screens, you have two screens showing simultaneously that are trying to use the same key for the shared element transition APIs. If you actually try this, it'll break. The shared element transition APIs will only render one, and then the rest will just be blank screens. So how do we actually make it work where we do shared element transitions across multiple screens? I got ahead of myself. But yeah, an element is either animating in or it's animating out. And in multi-pane apps, we may be trying to show two different panes with the shared element keys. How do we make this work, right? We can have that kind of transition. Again, this is why I said the scaffold state is really, really, really important. Because if you go to your scaffold state and you start adding arguments to it, if the scaffold for each pane knows what pane it's in, and again, my 3 pane here could be primary, secondary, tertiary, and so on, and then I start adding logic for whether I can show my navigation rail, and I start reading that metadata. Again, and the reason this metadata was, this is why I passed that metadata to my pane entry, because it's in my navigation state, which I can then pass to my screen. Well, what that lets me do is I can do something like a pane shared element, and then it'll take a shared content state. It takes a bounce transform. It takes a placeholder size, and your eyebrow might be raising in a second. And you're like, hey, this just looks like the regular shared element transition API. What exactly are you trying to do with this? The thing is here is that it is exactly the regular shared element transition API, but now I can start doing logic on my scaffold state that says, if I'm in the regular primary pane, I just want to proxy all of that to my regular shared element transition APIs. If I'm in the other panes, I don't want to do anything, but you may want to do something. And in my case, I did do something. I don't have enough time to go into it, but I will show you the effects of that something. But again, your scaffold state becomes the driving logic for what you can or cannot do in your panes. Okay, so remember when I sent my profile screen, I passed it the pane scaffold state? Okay, let's see what I did with it. And this one I figured is better to just show it live. I did say that this was multi-platform. So the very first thing I want to do is I have all of this code running using Kotlin and Compose multi-platform on an iPhone simulator. So here I just have a very simple basic pane. I am going to tap it. And now that I've tapped it, I can, I don't know, drag to dismiss. And this is using Navigation 3. Navigation 3 supports kind of showing like a predictive back. So when I drag this is actually a predictive back animation. I'll drag it. But again, that's one pane. I did say I have a pixel fold. So let's go to two panes. You haven't noticed I'm an Arsenal fan. Arsenal is my favorite club. I've been an Arsenal fan for forever. So this is the Blue Sky client that I was going to talk about. And here you can see I'm catching up with my latest Arsenal news. Apparently, Lewis Skelly, he's the youngest goal scorer for England, by the way. He has just signed a long-term contract. That's interesting. I want to look into that. So I tap it, and you might notice that was a shared element transition from one pane to the next. I kind of want to go into the athletic and see what the athletic is saying, or pretty much check out this profile. And then look at that, there's another shared element transition between panes. And the only reason I'm able to do this is because of that logic I had in my scaffold state. If you want to build a multi-pane app, you need to have the UI logic stakeholders to actually coordinate this for you. It gets better because here I was just looking at, this, but I actually want to see some goals. It's actually the Club World Cup. So I'm just gonna go here and then I'm gonna back out of this. Oh, there's let's see. Hopefully the Wi-Fi is strong enough. Okay, yeah. So some footy going on. Look at that. Shared element transitions with video, right? You can only do this kind of thing if you have the right architecture to support it. And using UI logic is the only way you can do this. And then I'm just gonna again, there's a video, the video is playing. I'm doing a shared element transition as the video is playing. I'm gonna release it and it just keeps working perfectly, right? So far I have shown you two platforms. I've shown you iPhone, I've shown you Android on a foldable. Let's go big. Here, I have it running on my Mac natively using Compose for desktop. And I can, again, I don't know, the New York Times is saying something, it's tennis season. And then again, I read The Verge often, but I can make this as big as I like, and also I can definitely resize my panes. And then this is a grid, and everything just dynamically. So using the right Compose APIs the right way lets you scale your app almost like, in other words, it becomes really really cheap to scale your app on big and bigger devices by just all you have to do is just add the right pane at the right time. I'm going to go bigger one more time with a sample app. I didn't have time to add it to this app. So here, I'm just going to start here with this simple app. Here, I'm going to go into this screen. I am going to go to this screen, and all of this seems really, really basic. I am going to make this wide enough to support two panes. So it's the same UI. I'm going to click it, but now I support two panes, and I can actually see two things at once. I'm going to click it, and then things animate in place. I go again, I go back, I go back. Do I hear three? Do we go for three? Let's go for three. I'm gonna go bigger. And then I'm going to click on one. But what happens when I click on two? I actually have space to three. So why don't I just show three of them? And obviously I can dynamically resize all of this and do what I want. So I've got three panes. So in other words, with that logic, with the right architecture, I have scaled to show 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 panes. And what does it cost me? It costs me nothing. All I have to do is add the right metadata in my pane entry to say my children, because again, this is a tree. I can have as many children as I want. All I have to do is add another pane or add another child to my nav entry. And because I have the mapping from panes to it, it will just scale. In other words, to scale from 1 to 2 to 3 screens, it's constant. It's like, you were going to talk about big O notation. It's not ON, it's O1. It's constant time as a developer to actually add, to build adaptive apps. It costs you zero time. So if your product manager is like, oh, I don't know if we can support doing that kind of thing, it costs nothing. You just have to put the right painting, put the right mapping to the pane. Okay, so I have shown you. Okay, let's go back to the slides here. All right. So, as a recap, with navigation 3, you own your own navigation state. When you own your navigation state, the responsibility is yours to flatten your navigation state to the backstack. How you want to do it is entirely up to you. I've shown you an example where I was using a tree. You can use a map. It's up to you. This way, if your product manager asks you to do anything new, you can do it because you own your own state. You should hoist your navigation state to your app state, and you should have your app state. If you're looking for an example of how to build an app state, the Now in Android sample does use an app state. So I would encourage you to go look at that sample and check out the app state there. You should also hoist any dependent UI there too. So your navigation bar, your navigation rail, if it's persistent, only if it's persistent. Then you should create a scaffold state to manage your panes. And then you can see how building an adaptive app is just mapping individual panes to your nav state. Now, everything I've said, most apps today aren't actually designed for hoisting their state. So, but if you look at this list, everything else I said you should do, you can do it today. The only thing you can't do today is own your own navigation state, which you'll be able to do when you eventually migrate to navigation 3. So in preparation, I would encourage you to start doing things like creating an app state and hoisting your navigation state in it. Now in Android uses navigation 2 with a navigation controller, and it and it uses an app state to manage that navigation. These are things you can do today. Create a scaffold state to manage your panes. You can do that today. So, again, I'm ahead of myself. But yeah, that is pretty much it. You can get in touch with me. I am tunji.dev. That is my website. That's where the blog that explains all of these things and other animations. If you just go to tunji.dev, you'll be able to read the articles about how to do this and also source code to this repository. Everything I showed you is public and open source. You can go check it out. And if you like Blue Sky, I'm on Blue Sky, and I'm also at tunji.dev on Blue Sky. Thank you so much for your time. And if you have any questions, yeah.